The silence in the room was so heavy it felt like it had weight. 8 people sat around a mahogany table, all dressed in black, all staring at a single document. The attorney had just spoken a name. But it wasn't the name of anyone in the room. It was the name of a 9-year-old golden retriever named Augustus. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then, like a dam bursting, the room exploded. Shouting. Accusations. The sound of a chair toppling over, someone demanding it be read again. Another person already on their phone, threatening to sue everyone present. But the attorney just sat there, hands folded over the will, waiting, because he knew something these people didn't know yet. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a sick joke, and it definitely wasn't something that could be undone. The Whitmore family fortune, accumulated over 3 generations and valued at approximately $17 million, had been legally transferred to a dog. But to understand how we got to that moment, we need to go back to the beginning, 6 months before that day, when Helena Whitmore was still alive. Helena was 82 years old when she died on March 14th, 2023. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though anyone who knew her would tell you Helena Whitmore's heart had been failing long before that final night. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. She died alone in her bedroom at the family estate in Westchester County, New York. The house sat on 11 acres, a sprawling colonial built in 1928 by her grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, who'd made his fortune in textile manufacturing before the Depression. The property was worth at least $4 million on its own, possibly more. Helena had lived there for 60 years, ever since she married into the family at 22. When the housekeeper found her that morning, Augustus was lying on the floor beside the bed. He hadn't left her side all night. The funeral was held 4 days later at St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Bedford. Everyone who mattered in Westchester society showed up. The Whitmores had been fixtures in the community for nearly a century. Helena had served on the boards of 3 local charities, hosted fundraisers, donated generously. People spoke highly of her. They used words like dignified, gracious, devoted, but the 8 people sitting in the front pews knew a different Helena. There was Robert Whitmore, 61, Helena's only child. He'd spent 30 years working in commercial real estate, mostly managing strip malls and office parks in Connecticut. He'd done well enough, but nothing compared to the family wealth he'd grown up around. Robert had always lived with the understanding that one day, all of it would be his. De estate, the investment portfolios. The trust funds his grandfather had established. He'd made financial plans around that assumption. He'd borrowed against it. Sitting next to Robert was his wife, Diane, 50. She taught art history at a private school and had spent most of their marriage quietly resenting the fact that the Whitmore money was always just out of reach, controlled by Helena, doled out in careful increments. Diane wanted to travel. She wanted a place in the city. She wanted things that Robert's salary couldn't provide and that Helena wouldn't pay for. Then there were the grandchildren. Mitchell, 34, Robert's son from his first marriage. He dropped out of business school 8 years ago to start a tech company that never quite got off the ground. He was currently between projects, which was his way of saying unemployed. Mitchell had been asking Helena for a loan for the past 2 years. She'd refused every time. Vanessa, 31, was Robert and Diane's daughter. She worked in marketing for a cosmetics company in Manhattan and lived in a tiny apartment in Astoria. That cost $3,000 a month. She was drowning in student debt from NYU and spent most family gatherings calculating how much her inheritance might be. She'd told friends she expected at least $2 million, maybe $3 million. Mitchell's youngest sister, Caroline, 29, had married into money, or so she thought. Her husband, Derek, turned out to be better at spending it than making it. They had 2 kids, a mortgage they couldn't afford, and credit card debt that kept them awake at night. Carolyn had been calling her grandmother once a week for the past year. Always pleasant, always asking how she was doing, always hoping for some sign that Helena might help them out. Then there was Sandra Whitmore, Helena's sister-in-law. Sandra had never worked a day in her life. She'd lived off her late husband's inheritance, Helena's brother, who died 15 years ago. But that money was nearly gone now. Spent on a lifestyle Sandra refused to downgrade. She'd been living in a condo Helena owned, rent-free, for the past decade. She assumed that arrangement was permanent. 2 more people rounded out the group. James Morrison, 55, who'd worked as Helena's financial advisor for 20 years, and Dr. Arthur Chun, 67, Helena's personal physician for the past 3 decades. Both men had been named in the will, though they didn't know it yet. Both had a reason to expect something. They'd been loyal. They'd been present. They'd earned it. At the funeral, everyone said the right things. They spoke about Helena's generosity, her strength, her dedication to family. Mitchell gave a eulogy that made several people cry. Vanessa posted photos on social media with captions about legacy and love. Caroline brought her children, who laid flowers on the casket. But in the parking lot afterward, the conversation changed. Robert pulled his son aside and asked if he knew anything about the will. Mitchell said he didn't, but he'd heard rumors that Helena had been meeting with attorneys a lot in the past year. Vanessa mentioned that Helena had sold some stock 6 months ago, a significant amount. Nobody knew where that money went. Sandra complained that Helena hadn't returned her calls in weeks before she died. Had anyone else noticed that? They had, because in the final months of her life, Helena Whitmore had started pulling away from all of them. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral, April 3rd. It took place at the offices of Whitmore and Associates, the family's longtime law firm in White Plains. The attorney handling the estate was Gerald Hastings, 62, who'd known Helena for 40 years. Everyone arrived early. Robert and Diane were there by 8:45, 15 minutes before the appointed time. Mitchell showed up wearing a suit he'd borrowed from a friend. Vanessa brought a leather notebook, ready to take notes. Caroline came alone. Derek had to work. Or so, says Said. Sandra arrived last, wearing pearls and perfume that filled the small conference room. James Morrison and Dr. Chun were already seated when the family walked in. Nobody questioned why they were there. It made sense. Helena had been generous to people she trusted. Gerald Hastings entered at 9 o'clock exactly, carrying a folder and a leather briefcase. He was a thin man with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from decades of delivering difficult news. He sat down, opened the folder, and looked around the table. He said he knew this had been a difficult time for everyone. He said Helena had been very specific about her wishes. He said everything in the will had been carefully planned and that there would be time for questions after he finished reading. Then he started. The first few minutes were standard. Helena left her personal jewelry to Vanessa, some paintings to Diane, her collection of first edition books to Micho, small items. Sentimental value. Everyone nodded politely, waiting for the real assets to be announced. Then Gerald got to the estate, the house in Westchester, he said, including all furnishings and the 11 acres of land, had been placed into a trust. The trust would be managed by James Morrison and Dr. Arthur Chun, acting as co-trustees. The property would not be sold. It would be maintained in perpetuity. Robert interrupted. He asked what that meant. In perpetuity, for whom Gerald paused. He said he'd get to that. He continued reading. Helena's investment portfolio, valued at approximately $8 million, had also been placed into the same trust. Her savings accounts, another $2 million. Her vintage car collection, worth roughly $500,000. The condo where Sandra lived, valued at $700,000. All of it, every asset, placed into a single, irrevocable trust. The room was quiet now. Everyone was doing math in their heads. Gerald cleared his throat. He said the trust had been established with a single beneficiary. He said that beneficiary would have full access to all funds necessary for their care, their comfort, their medical needs, and their quality of life. The trust would continue until the beneficiary's death, at which point any remaining assets would be donated to the ASPCA and several animal welfare organizations Helena had specified. Diane asked, who the beneficiary was, and that's when Gerald said the name Augustus. For a moment, nobody reacted. The name didn't register, and then Vanessa said, "Wait, do you mean the dog?" And Gerald nodded. He said Helena's golden retriever, Augustus, was now the sole beneficiary of the Whitmore family fortune. Mitchell laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, like something breaking. He said that couldn't be legal. You can't leave money to a dog, but Gerald explained that, yes, actually, you could. Animal trusts were perfectly legal in New York State. Helena had worked with 3 different attorneys to structure it properly. Every detail had been reviewed. Every potential challenge had been anticipated and blocked. Robert stood up. His face had gone red. He said this was insane. He said his mother couldn't have been in her right mind. He demanded to see a medical evaluation, proof of competency. Gerald opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. It was a psychiatric evaluation dated 6 months prior, signed by Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a respected neurosurgeon. Helena had been tested extensively. Her cognitive function was normal. There was no evidence of dementia, delusion, or coercion. She'd been fully competent when she made these decisions. Dr. June spoke for the first time. He said he'd seen Helena regularly up until a week before her death. She'd been sharp, clear, and very deliberate about everything she'd planned. Caroline started crying. She said, "This wasn't fair." She said her grandmother knew she was struggling. She said there were kids to think about, family responsibilities. But Gerald kept reading. He said Helena had left letters for each of them. Personal letters, explaining her decision. He handed them out, sealed envelopes with each person's name written in Helena's handwriting. Nobody opened them. Not right away. Sandra was shaking. She asked what would happen to the condo she'd been living in. Gerald said the trust would maintain it, but only as long as it was needed for Augustus. If Augustus required different housing, the condo would be sold. Vanessa asked how a dog could spend $17 million. Gerald explained that the money wasn't for the dog to spend. It was to ensure the dog received the highest possible standard of care for the rest of his life. Medical treatment, nutrition, grooming, trainers, housing, security. James Morrison and Dr. Chun would make all financial decisions in Augustus's best interest. And after Augustus died, everything goes to charity. Nothing to the family. Robert's voice was low when he spoke again. He said his mother had left them nothing. After everything, after a lifetime, she'd chosen a dog over her own son. Gerald corrected him. She'd left personal items. She'd left sentimental things. But yes, the estate itself, the bulk of the fortune, belonged to Augustus. Mitchell asked how long golden retrievers lived. Someone at the table, maybe James, said typically 10 to 12 years. Augustus was 9, so they had to wait. Wait for a dog to die, and even then, they'd get nothing. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Nobody said goodbye. They filed out of the conference room in silence, clutching their unopened letters. In the parking garage, Robert stood by his car and didn't move for 10 minutes. Diane sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. Vanessa called her boyfriend and told him she needed to leave the city for a few days. Caroline sat on a concrete barrier and cried while trying to figure out how to tell her husband. Mitchell was the first one to open his letter. He did it standing next to his car, ripping the envelope with shaking hands. It was 2 pages, handwritten. Helena's cursive was neat, careful, the writing of someone who'd been taught penmanship in grade school. The letter started simply. "Mitchell, I know you're angry right now. I know you feel betrayed. But I need you to understand something. This isn't about money. This was never about money." The letter went on. It talked about the last 8 years of Mitchell's life, the failed startup, the borrowed money, the promises he'd made and broken. It mentioned the time he'd asked Helena for $50,000 to invest in crypto. It mentioned another time he'd needed money for rent and then spent it on a vacation to Miami. But the letter wasn't cruel. It was sad. Helena wrote that she'd watched him lose himself. She'd watched him become someone who only called when he needed something, who only visited when he wanted something. She wrote that she loved him, but she couldn't enable him anymore. She couldn't watch him waste his potential waiting for an inheritance. The letter ended with a line that Mitchell would think about for months afterward. "You were never meant to wait for my money. You were meant to build your own life." One by one, the others opened their letters too. Robert's letter was longer. 3 pages. It talked about his childhood, his father's death when Robert was 16, the way Helena had tried to hold the family together. It talked about the resentment she'd felt from him over the years, the sense that he was waiting for her to die so he could finally have what he thought he deserved. She wrote about a conversation they'd had 5 years ago, Christmas dinner. Robert had gotten drunk and said something about how exhausting it was to be patient, to wait for his inheritance while she kept living. Helena had never forgotten it. She'd never forgiven it either. The letter told Robert that she'd supported him his entire life. She'd paid for his education, his first house, his children's educations. She'd given him more than most people ever received from their parents. But it was never enough. He always wanted more. More. She ended by writing that maybe now, without the promise of her money, he could finally learn to be grateful for what he already had. Vanessa's letter was shorter, but sharper. Helena wrote that she'd noticed the Instagram posts, the Facebook updates, the way Vanessa performed their relationship for an audience that didn't know them. She wrote about the calls that only came when Vanessa needed something, the visits that felt like obligations. There was a line in Vanessa's letter that cut deeper than the rest. "You loved the idea of having a wealthy grandmother more than you loved me." Caroline's letter was almost gentle by comparison. Helena acknowledged that Caroline's life was hard, that raising children was expensive, that Dareth wasn't helpful. But she also wrote that she'd offered Caroline help multiple times over the years. Not money, but opportunities, job references, introductions to people who could help, advice on managing finances. Caroline had ignored all of it. She'd only wanted cash. Sandra's letter was brief. It reminded her that Helena had supported her for 15 years after Sandra's husband died. It reminded her that the condo had been rent-free. It said that Helena had covered medical bills, vacations, and living expenses. And it said that Sandra had never once said thank you. Diane's letter was perhaps the most painful. Helena wrote that she'd always known Diane married Robert for security, not love. She wrote that she'd watched Diane resent the family for decades, while also demanding access to family money. She wrote that Diane had taught Vanessa to value wealth over relationships, and that Helena found that unforgivable. Each letter was different, but they all said the same thing in the end. "You stopped seeing me as a person. You only saw me as money." And that's when the family started to fracture. If you follow stories about families and what inheritance can do to them, you'll want to hear how this one ends. The next morning, Robert called an attorney, not Gerald Hastings, someone else, a litigator who specialized in estate disputes. Her name was Margaret Chun, no relation to Dr. Chun. She had a reputation for winning impossible cases. The will was airtight. Helena had been evaluated by a reputable psychiatrist. She'd used multiple attorneys to ensure everything was structured properly. The trust was irrevocable. New York state law explicitly allowed pet trusts. There was no legitimate legal basis to contest it. Robert asked, what if they argued undue influence? What if someone had convinced Helena to do this? Who? Margaret asked. Helena had made these decisions 6 months before she died. No relation. He brought the will, the psychiatric evaluation, and his letter from Helena. He explained the situation. He said it was unconscionable. He said no reasonable person would leave $17 million to a dog. He said there had to be grounds to challenge it. Margaret listened. Then she told him the truth. She'd been living alone, except for household staff. She'd been mentally competent. Unless Robert could prove someone manipulated her, which seemed unlikely, there was nothing to challenge. Robert spent $12,000 on legal consultations over the next 3 weeks. Every attorney told him the same thing. The will was valid. The trust was solid. Augustus was legally entitled to the Whitmore fortune. Meanwhile, the family was imploding. Mitchell stopped talking to Robert after he found out his father had consulted attorneys without telling anyone. He accused Robert of trying to steal whatever scraps might be left. Robert said that wasn't true. He was trying to protect the family. Vanessa sided with her father at first, then changed her mind when she realized he wasn't including her in the legal strategy. She started calling James Morrison directly, asking questions about the trust, trying to understand if there were any loopholes. James was professional but firm. The trust was managed for Augustus's benefit. Nothing else. Caroline was the first one to break completely. She showed up at the Westchester estate 3 weeks after the will reading, demanding to see Augustus, the housekeeper, a woman named Rosa, who'd worked for Helena for 12 years, tried to explain that the house was closed to visitors. Caroline pushed past her. She walked through the rooms she'd grown up visiting, touching furniture, looking at paintings, calculating value. She found Augustus in the sunroom, lying on a cushion near the window. She stood there staring at him. This dog, this animal, was worth more than her entire life, more than her house, more than her children's college funds, more than her future. Rosa called James Morrison. By the time he arrived, Caroline was sitting on the floor next to Augustus, crying. James helped her up. He walked her outside. He was kind about it, but clear. She couldn't come back. The estate was part of the trust now. It wasn't family property anymore. That night, Caroline's husband Derek got drunk and posted a rant on Facebook about rich people and their sick games. He didn't name Helena, but everyone knew what he was talking about. The post went semi-viral in their social circle. People commented. Some agreed. Some said the family must have done something to deserve it. Vanessa saw the post and called Carolyn, furious. She said Derek was making them all look bad. She said if they wanted any chance of changing things, they needed to be strategic, not emotional. But Caroline was done being strategic. She said Helena had been cruel. She said leaving money to a dog was punishment, and whatever the family had done, they didn't deserve this. Vanessa asked what Caroline meant by whatever they'd done. Caroline hung up. The question hung in the air, though. What had they done? Sandra was the first to start digging into the past. She'd lived through more of the family history than anyone else. She'd been there when Helena married into the Whitmore family 60 years ago. She'd watched Helena navigate the complex social dynamics, the expectations, the pressures. Sandra started going through old photographs, old letters. She called cousins who'd moved away decades ago. She asked questions about Helena's marriage, about Robert's father, about the early years, and slowly a different picture started to emerge. Helena hadn't come from money. She'd grown up in modest circumstances in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a teacher and a nurse. She met Robert's father, William Whitmore, when she was 21. It was 35, charming, from a wealthy family. It seemed like a fairy tale. They married quickly, too quickly, some people said. Helena moved into the Westchester estate 6 months after they met. She was young, naive, completely unprepared for what she was walking into. William's family had expectations. The Whitmore name meant something. Helena was expected to dress a certain way, speak a certain way, host parties, serve on charity boards, be seen at the right places with the right people. She did all of it. She learned fast. But according to Sandra, the marriage was complicated. William had a temper. He drank. He made business decisions that put the family fortune at risk, then blamed Helena when things went wrong. He had affairs, more to tongue one. Helena knew about them. Everyone knew about them. Sandra remembered a dinner party in 1970. William had shown up drunk with another woman, not even trying to hide it. Helena had smiled through the entire evening, played the perfect hostess, then disappeared into her bedroom for 3 days afterward. Robert was born in 19... Helena had hoped a child would change things. It didn't. William became more distant. He traveled constantly for business, or so he claimed. Helena raised Robert essentially alone. When Robert was 16, William died in a car accident. He'd been driving drunk, hit a tree on a back road in Connecticut. The official story was that it was a tragedy, but people whispered about whether it might have been something else. Intentional. A way out. Helena never remarried. She threw herself into managing the family estate, the investments, the properties. She was good at it. Better than William had been. Over the next 40 years, she doubled the family fortune, but she did it alone. Robert grew up watching his mother work constantly, managed everything, sacrificed everything for the family legacy. And according to Sandra, he resented her for it. Robert wanted a mother who baked cookies and came to soccer games. Instead, he got a mother who was always in meetings, always on the phone with attorneys and accountants, always managing money that he couldn't touch. He blamed her for his father's death. He blamed her for the pressure he felt to live up to the Whitmore name. He blamed her for everything that went wrong in his life. Sandra told this story to Diane one afternoon over coffee. Diane listened, and then she said something that changed everything. She said, "You know Robert had her declared incompetent once." Sandra froze. "What?" Diane explained. 15 years ago, when Helena was 67, Robert had tried to get power of attorney over her finances. He'd claimed she was making risky investments, that she was losing her judgment. He'd hired a lawyer. He'd actually filed paperwork. Helena had fought back. She'd gotten her own attorney. She'd submitted to a full psychiatric evaluation. She'd proven she was completely competent. The case was dismissed, but she never forgot it. She never forgave Robert for trying to take control while she was still alive. Sandra asked why she'd never heard about this. Diane said, Helena made Robert promise to keep it quiet. She didn't want the family name dragged through court proceedings. She agreed to drop the matter if Robert never brought it up again. He'd agreed, but Helena had stopped trusting him after that. According to Diane, that was when Helena started restructuring her estate, meeting with new attorneys, setting up trusts that Robert couldn't touch. Sandra asked why Diane was telling her this. No, Diane said, because Robert was planning something. He'd been meeting with forensic accountants, people who specialized in finding irregularities in trusts and estates. He was looking for any mistake, any loophole, anything he could use to break the will. And Diane was tired of it, tired of watching her husband obsess over money that wasn't his, tired of the fights, tired of pretending they were a functional family. She said, maybe Helena was right. Maybe they didn't deserve the inheritance. This conversation happened 7 weeks after Helena's death. By then, the family had essentially stopped speaking to each other. Robert was consumed with legal strategies. Mitchell had moved back home with his father, mostly because he couldn't afford rent. Vanessa was posting vague complaints on social media about family trauma. Caroline had stopped attending family gatherings entirely. And Augustus was living in the Westchester estate, completely unaware that he was at the center of a family war. James Morrison and Dr. Chun had taken their roles as trustees seriously. They'd hired a live-in caretaker for Augustus, a woman named Patricia, who had 20 years of experience training therapy dogs. They'd upgraded the estate's security system. They'd established a medical fund that would cover anything Augustus might need. Augustus's daily routine was carefully structured. Morning walks around the property, high-quality meals prepared by a pet nutritionist, regular vet checkups, grooming every week, toys, enrichment activities, socialization with other dogs. Brought in foreplay. The trust was spending approximately $15,000 per month on Augustus's care, which sounds absurd until you factor in property maintenance, staff salaries, medical insurance, and security. James Morrison gave an interview to a local newspaper about the trust. He said, people misunderstood what they were doing. This wasn't about spoiling a pet. This was about honoring a woman's final wishes. Helena had been clear about why she structured her estate this way, and they were going to respect that. The interviewer asked what those reasons were. James said they were personal, family matters. He wouldn't elaborate, but the letters everyone had received explained everything. Robert finally read his letter fully about 8 weeks after Helena's death. He'd skimmed it before, but he'd been too angry to really absorb the words. This time, he read every line. Helena wrote about the day he'd tried to have her declared incompetent. She described how she'd felt when she realized her own son was trying to take control of her. Finances, betrayed, heartbroken, afraid. She wrote that she'd worked her entire life to build something stable, something secure. After William died, she'd made choices that protected the family wealth. She'd been careful, strategic, responsible, and Robert had repaid that by trying to claim she was too senile to manage her own affairs. She wrote that she'd forgiven him, but she'd never forgotten, and she'd made decisions based on what she'd learned about who he really was. The letter ended with a paragraph that Robert read over and over. "You see Augustus. It's a dog. I saw him as the only creature in this house who loved me without wanting something in return. He never asked me for money. He never calculated what he might inherit. He never made me feel like I was only valuable because of my bank account. He sat with me when I was sick. He stayed with me when I was lonely. He gave me comfort without expecting anything but food and affection in return. That's why he got everything. Because he was the only one who saw me as Helena, not as a trust fund with a pulse." The words broke something in Robert. He showed the letter to Diane. She read it and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked if he thought it was true. Robert said he didn't know. Maybe. Diane said she thought it probably was. Mitchell found his father crying at the kitchen table that night. It was the first time he'd seen his father cry since the funeral. Mitchell sat down across from him and asked what was wrong. Robert handed him Helena's letter. Mitchell read it. Then he pulled out his own letter and slid it across the table. They sat there, two grown men, reading about their own failures, spelled out in careful cursive handwriting, reading about how they'd treated someone they claimed to love, reading about how they'd reduced a human being to a dollar amount. Mitchell said he'd been thinking about the past 8 years. All the times he'd called Helena, asking for money. All the times he'd promised to pay her back and never did. All the times he'd lied about what he needed the money for. He said he remembered one Christmas, 3 years ago. Helena had given him a check for $5,000. He'd said it was for a business expense, a website developer. He'd actually spent it on a trip to Vegas with friends. Helena never said anything, but she never gave him money again after that. Mitchell said he used to think she was being controlling. Now he realized she'd just been tired of being used. Robert asked what they were supposed to do now. Mitchell said he didn't know. Learn to live with it, maybe. But Robert wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. He contacted Margaret Chun again. He said he wanted to pursue a different strategy. If they couldn't break the will, maybe they could prove the trustees were mismanaging the funds. Maybe they could get James and Dr. Chun removed and have new trustees appointed. Trustees who might be more sympathetic to the family. Margaret said that was possible, but they'd need evidence. Real evidence of mismanagement or misconduct. Just spending money on a dog, even a lot of money, wasn't enough. The trust was legally obligated to spend money on Augustus's care. Robert said he'd find something. He hired a private investigator to look into James Morrison's finances. He wanted to know if James was somehow benefiting from the trust, skimming funds, anything that could be used against him. The investigator's report came back 6 weeks later. James Morrison was clean. His finances were transparent. He wasn't taking any fees for serving as trustee. He was actually losing money, spending his own time managing the trust without compensation, because he'd promised Helena he would. Robert tried the same thing with Dr. Chun. Another dead end. Dr. Chun was a respected physician with an impeccable record. He visited Augustus weekly, provided medical care at no charge, documented everything meticulously. Robert was running out of options and running out of money. He'd spent over $40,000 on attorneys and investigators. His own finances were strained. Diane had started suggesting they sell their house and downsize. That's when Vanessa came to him with an idea. She'd been doing research on pet trusts, reading legal cases, looking for precedents. She found something. A case in Florida where a family had successfully challenged a pet trust by arguing that the amount left to the pet was excessive and unreasonable. The court in that case had ruled that, while pet trusts were legal, they couldn't be used to circumvent estate laws or deprive rightful heirs. The judge had reduced the pet's inheritance and redistributed the excess to the family. Vanessa thought they could use the same argument. $17 million for a dog was excessive. Unreasonable. No dog needed that much money. A judge might agree to reduce the trust and distribute the remainder to the family. Robert met with Margaret Chun again. She reviewed the Florida case. She said it was a long shot. New York law was different from Florida law, and Helena's trust had been structured specifically to withstand this kind of challenge, but it was possible. Maybe, Margaret said. If they wanted to pursue it, they'd need to file a formal petition with the court. It would be expensive, it would be public, and it would destroy whatever was left of the family's privacy. Robert said he didn't care anymore. The petition was filed on June 15th, 3 months after Helena's death. The case was Whitmore v. Morrison and Chun, trustees of the Augustus Whitmore Trust. The filing made headlines. Local newspapers picked it up first, then regional ones. By the end of the week, it was a national story. Family challenges, trust leaving fortune to dog. It was the kind of story people loved to share, debate, argue about. Vanessa's Instagram and Facebook were flooded with comments. Some people supported the family. Others said they were greedy. The comment sections turned vicious. Caroline's husband, Derek, gave an interview to a local news station. He talked about how the family was struggling, how they had kids to support, how it was cruel to leave them with nothing. The interview made things worse. People online found his Facebook post from months ago. They called him entitled. They said the family clearly didn't deserve the money. Mitchell tried to stay out of it. He'd realized somewhere along the way that his grandmother had been right about him. He'd spent years waiting for something instead of building something. He'd blamed his failures on not having enough money, when the real problem was that he'd never learned to be responsible with what he had. He got a job, nothing glamorous. Sales position at a software company. It paid $60,000 a year. He rented a small apartment. He started paying back some of the debts he'd accumulated. He didn't join the lawsuit. Robert called him a traitor. Mitchell said he was just tired of fighting over a dead woman's money. The court hearing was scheduled for September. Over the summer, both sides prepared their cases. Robert's legal team argued that the trust was excessive, that it deprived rightful heirs of their inheritance, that it violated the spirit of estate law. They brought in financial experts who testified that a dog could be well cared for with a fraction of the money Helena had left. James Morrison and Dr. Chun's legal team argued that Helena had the right to dispose of her property as she wished. She'd been competent. She'd been deliberate. The trust was legal. The amount was her decision to make. They also argued something else. They said this wasn't really about the dog. It was about control. Helena had watched her family treat her like a bank for decades. She'd watched them wait for her to die so they could inherit. She'd made a choice to leave her money to the one being who loved her without conditions. That wasn't excessive. That was her right. The judge in the case was Maria Gonzalez, 58, who'd been on the bench for 15 years. She had a reputation for being fair but strict. She didn't like frivolous cases, and she didn't like families fighting over money. The hearing lasted 3 days. Dozens of witnesses testified. Financial experts, estate, attorneys, even a veterinarian who explained what it actually costs to care for a dog. On the third day, the judge asked to see the letters, the personal letters Helena had written to each family member. Robert's attorney objected. The letters were private, not relevant to the legal question. But Judge Gonzalez said they were absolutely relevant. She wanted to understand Helena's state of mind, her intentions, her relationship with the people challenging her will. The letters were submitted into evidence. The judge read them in her chambers. She took her time. When court resumed, Judge Gonzalez looked tired. She said she'd read the letters carefully. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence. She said she was ready to make a ruling. She started by explaining that New York law gave people broad authority to dispose of their property as they saw fit. Pet trusts were legal. The amount left to Augustus, while substantial, was not so excessive as to be unconscionable given the size of the estate and the cost of maintaining the property. Then she said something that no one expected. She said she'd presided over hundreds of estate cases. She'd seen families destroy themselves over money. She'd seen children contest their parents' wills out of greed, spite, or both. But this case was different. Judge Gonzalez said that after reading the letters, she understood exactly what Helena Whitmore had been doing. This wasn't about the dog. This was about sending a message that the family in front of her had failed to hear even after her death. She said Helena had spent 60 years being treated as a source of money rather than as a person. She'd been manipulated, used, and taken for granted by people who were supposed to love her. The pet trust wasn't punishment. It was the last lesson of a woman who tried everything else. Judge Gonzalez denied the petition. The trust would stand. Augustus would remain the beneficiary. The family would receive nothing beyond what Helena had already given them in the will. Then she said one more thing. She said she hoped the family would take this time to reflect on why Helena made the choice she did, because from where Judge Gonzalez sat, it seemed entirely justified. The ruling was final. There would be no appeal. Margaret Chun explained to Robert that appealing would cost another $100,000 with virtually no chance of success. You were done. Robert walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps for a long time. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. He didn't answer any of them. He just stood there, staring at nothing. Diane was waiting in the car. She didn't ask how it went. She already knew from his face. They drove home in silence. When they got there, Robert went upstairs to his office and closed the door. Diane sat in the kitchen and thought about the past 30 years of her marriage. All the time spent planning for an inheritance that was never going to come. All the resentment she'd carried toward Helena. All the ways she'd taught her daughter to value money over relationships. She thought about Vanessa, who still wasn't speaking to her. Vanessa blamed Diane for convincing Robert to fight the will. She said it made them look like monsters. She said her Instagram followers had turned on her, that she'd lost friends, that job prospects had dried up because employers could Google her name and find articles about the greedy family suing over a dog. Diane had tried to explain that it wasn't about greed, it was about fairness. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It had always been about greed, maybe not entirely, but enough. That evening, Mitya showed up at his father's house. He let himself in with the key he still had. He found Robert in his office, staring at Helena's letter. Mitchell sat down without being invited. He said he'd heard about the ruling. He said he was sorry. Robert said he didn't want sympathy. Mitchell said that wasn't why he was there. He said he'd been thinking about something Helena wrote in his letter. The line about building his own life instead of waiting for hers to end. He said he'd spent the past 4 months trying to do that. He had a job now. It wasn't much, but it was his. He was paying his own rent. He was paying back debts. For the first time in years, he wasn't lying to himself about who he was. He said it felt better than he expected, not having the money. Not waiting for it. Just living. Robert asked if Mitchell was trying to make a point. Mitchell said yes. He said their grandmother had given them something more valuable than money. She'd given them a chance to become people who didn't need her money. Robert said that was easy for Micho to say. He was 34. He had time to rebuild. Robert was 61. He'd made financial decisions based on an inheritance he'd thought was guaranteed. He had debts. He had obligations. He didn't have time to start over. Mitchell said, maybe that was the problem. Maybe spending 61 years waiting for someone else's money was what got him here. It was harsh. Robert told him to leave. Mitchell did, but the word stayed with Robert. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Robert started going through his finances, really looking at them for the first time in years. He'd been living beyond his means for so long that he'd stopped noticing. The house they couldn't afford. The country club membership they didn't use. The car leases. The credit cards. He'd been spending as though the inheritance was already his. Now he had to face the fact that it never would be. Diane found him at the kitchen table one night, surrounded by bills and bank statements. She asked what he was doing. He said he was figuring out what they could actually afford. She sat down across from him. She said they needed to sell the house. He nodded. She said they needed to simplify their lives. He nodded again. She asked if he was okay. He said no, but he would be. They put the house on the market in October. It sold 6 weeks later. They moved into a smaller place, a condo in Stamford. It was a third of the size of their old house. The mortgage was manageable. Diane kept teaching. Robert kept working. They paid down debt. They stopped going out to expensive restaurants. They stopped pretending to be wealthier than they were. It wasn't the life they'd imagined, but it was real. Caroline's situation was worse. She and Derek were drowning. The mortgage was 3 months behind. Credit cards were maxed out. They'd taken out a loan against Derek's parents' house and couldn't make the payments. Caroline called Robert and begged for help, just enough to cover the mortgage until they figured things out. Robert said he didn't have it. She didn't believe him. She hung up, thinking he was punishing her for something. 2 months later, Caroline and Derek filed for bankruptcy. They lost the house. They moved into a rental apartment, cramped and loud and nothing like what they'd had before. The kids shared a bedroom. There was no yard, no playroom, no space. Caroline blamed Helena. She told friends that her grandmother had destroyed their lives. She said, leaving money to a dog while your own family suffered was unforgivable. But Derek said something one night that Caroline couldn't stop thinking about. He said, maybe this was their fault. Maybe they'd been living like they had money they didn't have. Maybe they'd been counting on an inheritance instead of building something sustainable. Caroline said that wasn't fair. Derek said maybe not, but it was true. They started over. Derek took a second job. Caroline went back to work part-time. They made a budget and stuck to it. They stopped buying things they couldn't afford. They stopped comparing themselves to other families. It was hard. It was humiliating, but slowly they started to stabilize. Vanessa's story was different. She didn't have debt the way Caroline did. She had a good job, a stable income, but she'd been living for appearances. The apartment she couldn't quite afford, the designer clothes, the restaurants and bars and lifestyle that looked good on Instagram. After the lawsuit failed, after the negative press, after friends started avoiding her, Vanessa had a breakdown. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one. She just woke up one morning and realized she didn't recognize herself. She'd spent her entire adult life performing success, performing happiness, performing having it all figured out. And for what? For people who didn't actually know her. For validation from strangers on the internet. Her grandmother had seen through it. Helena had known Vanessa was empty inside, chasing something she couldn't name, trying to fill a void with things that didn't matter. Vanessa read her letter again. The line about loving the idea of having a wealthy grandmother more than loving Helena herself. It was true. She'd been so focused on what Helena represented that she'd never bothered to know who Helena actually was. She'd never asked about Helena's life. Her marriage, her struggles, her loneliness. She'd never asked about anything that didn't relate to money or inheritance or what she might get someday. Vanessa quit Instagram, just deleted the app. She stopped posting, stopped performing, stopped caring what people thought. She moved to a smaller apartment. She started seeing a therapist. The therapist asked what she wanted from life. Vanessa realized she didn't know. She'd been so busy wanting what other people had that she'd never figured out what she actually wanted for herself. It took months, but slowly, Vanessa started building something real. Not a performance, not an image. Choose a life. Sandra's experience was perhaps the most devastating. She'd spent 15 years living off Helena's generosity without ever acknowledging it. She'd taken everything for granted. The free housing, the covered expenses, the safety net. After the will was read, after she realized the condo might be sold, Sandra panicked. She had almost no savings. Her late husband's money was gone. She was 79 years old, with no plan, no resources, no options. She called every family member she could think of. Robert couldn't help. Caroline couldn't help. Vanessa said she was dealing with her own problems. Mitchell didn't return her calls. Sandra ended up moving in with a cousin in New Jersey. She had one bedroom in a small house. She had a bathroom, had no privacy. After decades of comfortable living, she was essentially dependent on charity. She wrote a letter to James Morrison. She said it wasn't fair. She said Helena owed her. They were family. Sisters-in-law for over 50 years. How could Helena leave her with nothing? James wrote back. He said Helena had left her with nothing because Sandra had never appreciated what she'd already been given. He said Helena had covered Sandra's expenses for 15 years, and Sandra had never said thank you. Not once. He said, the condo was being maintained as part of Augustus's trust, but Sandra was no longer welcome there. He wished her well. Sandra burned the letter, but she couldn't burn the truth in it. 6 months after the court ruling, life had settled into a new normal for everyone. Robert and Diane were adjusting to their smaller life. Caroline and Derek were rebuilding from bankruptcy. Vanessa was learning who she was without the performance. Sandra was learning to live with less. And Mitchell was thriving. He'd been promoted at work. He'd paid off most of his debts. He'd started dating someone, a woman who knew nothing about the Whitmore family drama and didn't care. For the first time in his adult life, Mitchell felt like he was building something that belonged to him. He thought about calling his grandmother sometimes, wishing he could tell her, wishing he could say he understood now what she'd been trying to teach him. One afternoon in March, almost a year after Helena's death, Mitchell drove to the Westchester estate. He called ahead and asked James Morrison if he could visit. James hesitated. 10 said yes. Mitchell arrived at 2 in the afternoon. The estate looked the same. The gardens were maintained. The house was clean. Everything was exactly as Helena had kept it. James met him at the door. They shook hands. James asked why he'd come. Mitchell said he wanted to see Augustus. He wanted to understand what his grandmother had seen. James led him to the sunroom. Augustus was there, older now, grayer around the muzzle. He looked up when Mitchell entered, tail wagging slowly. Mitchell sat on the floor. Augustus walked over and rested his head on Mitchell's knee. They sat like that for a while. Mitchell patted the dog's head, scratched behind his ears. Augustus closed his eyes, content. Michi understood then. It wasn't that Helena loved this dog more than her family. It was that this dog had loved her in a way the family never did. Unconditionally, without expectations. Without calculating what he might get from her. Augustus didn't see a bank account. He saw a person who fed him and walked him and sat with him. That was enough. The family had never thought that was enough. James stood in the doorway watching. After a while, he said Augustus had about 2 years left. Maybe 3 if they were lucky. Golden retrievers didn't live forever. When Augustus died, the trust would dissolve. The estate would be sold. The money would go to charity, as Helena had specified. Mitchell asked which charities. James said mostly animal welfare organizations, shelters, rescue groups, places that took care of animals nobody else wanted. Mitchell smiled. Of course, Helena had always liked taking care of things other people overlooked. He asked if he could visit Augustus again. James said yes, as long as he understood the boundaries, as long as he wasn't trying to change anything. Mitchell said he wasn't. He just wanted to visit. Maybe once a month, just to sit with the dog. Just to remember. James said that would be fine. Over the next year, Mitchell came back regularly. Sometimes he brought treats. Sometimes he just sat on the floor and talked. He told Augustus about his life, his job, his girlfriend. He talked about things he'd never told anyone else. He talked about his regrets, the years wasted, the opportunities missed, the ways he'd hurt people without realizing it. Augustus listened, that was all. Just listened. Robert never visited. He couldn't bring himself to. The idea of sitting in that house, the house that should have been his, visiting a dog that had inherited his mother's fortune, was too much. Too humiliating. Too painful. but he thought about it sometimes. Late at night when he couldn't sleep, he wondered what Helena had been thinking in those final months. When she'd decided to do this, when she'd structured the trust, when she'd written those letters. He wondered if she'd been angry, if she'd wanted to hurt them, or if she'd been sad, disappointed, hoping they'd learn something. He'd never know, and that was its own kind of punishment. Diane asked him once if he regretted fighting the will. He said no. Then, after a long pause, he sighed maybe. Then he said he didn't know. She said she regretted it. She regretted the money they'd spent on lawyers. She regretted the publicity. She regretted teaching Vanessa that money was more important than relationships. She regretted a lot of things. Robert said they couldn't change it now. Diane sighed no, but they could learn from it. She'd been reading Helena's letter over and over, especially the part about resentment. Helena had written that she'd felt Diane's resentment for 30 years. Every family dinner, every holiday, every interaction. Diane had been angry that the Whitmore money was always just out of reach, controlled by Helena, never quite accessible. Helena had known. She'd felt it, and it had hurt her. Diane realized she'd spent 3 decades resenting someone who'd never actually owed her anything. Helena hadn't been required to share her money. She'd chosen to help when she could, but that had been a gift, not an obligation. Diane had treated it like a right, like something she deserved simply for marrying into the family. She apologized to Robert one night. She said she was sorry for pushing him to fight, sorry for the pressure, sorry for making everything about money. Robert said it wasn't just her. He'd done it too. They'd both done it. They sat together in their small condo, in the life they'd been forced to build from scratch, and realized they were happier now than they'd been in years. Not because they had more money, they had less, but because they weren't waiting anymore. They weren't performing. They were just living. Vanessa reconnected with her parents slowly. She called Robert first, then Diane. She said she was sorry for blaming them. She said she'd been angry at the wrong people. The problem wasn't the lawsuit. The problem was all of them. Everything they'd done for years before Helena died. She said she'd been in therapy working through it. Her therapist had helped her see patterns. The way she'd learned to value things over people. The way she'd learned to perform instead of connecting. The way she'd learned that love was transactional. She didn't blame her parents for teaching her that. She was an adult. She'd made her own choices. But she understood now where it came from. Robert asked if Vanessa had forgiven Helena. Vanessa said she didn't know if forgiveness was the right word. She understood Helena now. She understood why she'd done what she'd done. That was something. Caroline never forgave Helena. She stayed angry. She told her children that their great-grandmother had been cruel. She said money makes people do terrible things. She said they should never trust wealthy relatives. Derek disagreed. He thought Helena had been smart. She'd seen what was happening to a family. She tried to change it. The pet trust wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. But Caroline couldn't see it that way. The anger was easier. Anger meant she didn't have to examine her own role in what happened. Anger meant she could stay a victim. She and Derek grew apart. The bankruptcy had strained things, the constant financial pressure, the resentment. They divorced 3 years after Helena's death. Caroline got a small apartment. She worked 2 jobs. She co-parented with Derek. Life was hard, but she managed. Her children asked about Helena sometimes. Why had she left everything to a dog? Caroline never knew how to answer. She'd tell them it was complicated. They were too young to understand. But she wondered sometimes if they'd understand better than she did. If they'd see what she couldn't see. That Helena had been trying to teach them all something important. Sandra died 2 years after Helena. A stroke, quick and unexpected. She was. No one mentioned Helena. They said the standard things people say at funerals. She lived a full life. She's at peace now. We'll miss her. But afterward, Robert said something to Mitchell. He said Sandra had died bitter, angry at the world, convinced she'd been wronged. Mitchell said that was sad. Robert said it was a choice. Sandra could have chosen differently. Mitchell asked if Robert thought he'd chosen differently, if he'd let go of the anger. Robert said he was trying. At her funeral, there were maybe 20 people. Some cousins, a few friends. Mitchell came. Vanessa came. Robert and Diane came. No one talked about the inheritance. That was all he could do. Augustus died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in April, 2 years and 1 month after Helena. He was 11 years old. Patricia found him in his bed in the sunroom, peaceful, as if he'd simply decided it was time. James Morrison called Mitchell first. Mitchell called the rest of the family. They all knew what it meant. The trust would dissolve now. The estate would be sold. The money would go to charity. There was a small burial ceremony. Who's Patricia James, Dr. Chun, and Mitchell? They buried Augustus in the garden, near a stone bench where Helena used to sit. James said a few words. He said Augustus had been a good dog. He said Helena had been right to leave him everything. He said this dog had received more genuine love in his last 2 years than most humans got in a lifetime. Mitchell said he hoped Helena and Augustus were together somewhere. James said he wasn't religious, but he hoped so too. The estate went on the market a week later. It sold for $6 million. Combined with the remaining trust assets, there was about $14 million to distribute. Helena had specified 16 different animal welfare organizations, shelters in 3 states, rescue groups, low-cost veterinary clinics, organizations that trained service dogs, organizations that protected wildlife habitats. Each organization received notification that they were beneficiaries of the Augustus Whitmore Trust. Most of them had never heard of Helena Whitmore. They were stunned by the amount. $500,000. 800,000. One organization received $2 million. The money would save thousands of animals. It would fund medical care, adoption programs, facility improvements. It would create lasting change. Helena's legacy wasn't her children or grandchildren. It was this, helping creatures who couldn't help themselves, creating good in the world through the fortunes she'd spent 60 years protecting. The family learned about the distributions through a final letter from James Morrison. He sent it to Robert, Mitchell, Vanessa, and Caroline. He explained where the money had gone and why. He ended the letter with a line from Helena's original instructions. She'd written, "I want my money to go where it'll do the most good. My family didn't need it. They needed to learn to live without it. These organizations need it. And the animals, they help deserve it." Robert read the letter alone in his study. He thought about his mother's life. 60 years in that house. 60 years managing money, making careful decisions, sacrificing personal happiness for family stability. And in the end, she decided her family didn't deserve what she'd built. That hurt. It would always hurt. But he understood now why she'd made that choice. He understood what she'd been trying to tell them. Love isn't about money. Family isn't about inheritance. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind financially. It's about how you treat people while you're alive. The Whitmore family had failed that test. All of them, in different ways. They'd treated Helena like a bank. They'd calculated her worth in dollars. They'd waited for her to die so they could finally get what they thought they deserved. Augustus had simply loved her. That was the difference. That was everything. Mitchell framed a photo of Augustus and hung it in his apartment. His girlfriend asked who it was. He said it was his grandmother's dog, the one who inherited everything. She asked if he was angry about that. He said no. He said it was probably the best thing that ever happened to his family. She didn't understand. He said he didn't expect her to, but he knew it was true. The photo showed Augustus in the garden, lying in the sun, looking content, happy, loved. That's what Helena had wanted, for someone in her life to be happy and loved without conditions or expectations. Since she couldn't have it herself, she'd made sure Augustus did. It was the last gift of a woman who'd spent her life giving to people who never appreciated it. Vanessa went to Helena's grave for the first time 2 years after she died. She'd been too angry before, then too ashamed. Finally, she was ready. She brought flowers. She sat on the grass. She talked to the headstone like Helena could hear her. She said she was sorry. Sorry for being selfish. Sorry for only seeing the money. Sorry for never knowing Helena as a person. She said she wished she'd asked more questions about Helena's life, her marriage, what made her happy, what made her sad, the things that mattered. She said she understood now what Helena had been trying to teach them. That wealth without love is empty. That family without genuine connection is just a legal designation. That you can't buy your way out of being a better person. She said she was trying to be better. Trying to build a life based on things that mattered. Trying to connect with people authentically instead of transactionally. She said thank you for the hard lesson. For caring enough to teach them, even though they'd given her no reason to care. She said goodbye. As she walked back to her car, Vanessa thought about the years ahead. She thought about the family they'd been, and the family they might become. They'd never be close. Probably. Too much had happened. Too much resentment. Too much pain. But maybe they could be honest. Maybe they could be real. Maybe they could stop pretending and start accepting who they actually were. That would be its own kind of inheritance. Not money, not property. Just truth. 5 years after Helena's death, the family gathered for Thanksgiving at Mitchell's house. It was small, casual. Mitchell and his wife, who he'd married 2 years before. Robert and Diane. Vanessa and her new partner. Caroline didn't come. She was spending the holiday with Derek's family. They'd remained friendly after the divorce, better than they'd been married. They ate dinner. They talked about normal things, jobs, hobbies, the weather. Nobody mentioned Helena. Nobody mentioned the inheritance. But later, after dinner, Mitchell pulled out a photo album. Old pictures of the family. Holidays at the Westchester estate. Helena in her garden. Augustus as a puppy. They looked through it together. Diane said Helena looked happy in the old photos. Robert said she'd been happy back when he was young, before everything got complicated. Vanessa asked what happened. What changed? Roberta said they did. The family changed. They got greedy. They got entitled. They forgot how to appreciate what they had because they were always focused on what they might get someday. Mitchell said Helena tried to tell them. For years, she tried. But they didn't listen. Diane said they were listening now. Better late than never. Robert said maybe, or maybe it was too late. They sat in silence for a while, looking at pictures of a family that didn't exist anymore. A family that had destroyed itself over money they never received. Vanessa said she thought Helena would be proud of them now. For trying, for learning, for becoming people who didn't need an inheritance to have a life. Robert said he hoped so, but he'd never know. That was the real punishment. Not the lost money, not the failed inheritance. The uncertainty, the not knowing if Helena had forgiven them, if she'd seen potential in them, if she'd believed they could change. She'd left them letters explaining why they didn't deserve her fortune, but she'd never left a letter saying what they needed to do to deserve her forgiveness. Maybe that was intentional. Maybe she wanted them to figure it out themselves. Or maybe she'd been too hurt to care. Mitchell closed the photo album. He said they should remember Helena the way she deserved to be remembered, as a woman who built something meaningful, who protected what mattered, who loved someone unconditionally, even if that someone was a dog. She'd taught them a lesson they'd never forget. That wealth means nothing without love. That family means nothing without respect. That you can't inherit what matters most. You have to earn it. The Whitmore fortune was gone, spent on dog care, donated to charity. The family name would fade. The estate had been sold to strangers. Nothing remained of 3 generations of accumulated wealth, except memories and lessons learned too late. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Helena knew that money couldn't change them. Only loss could. Only the complete destruction of their expectations could force them to see what they'd become. It was a brutal lesson, a painful one. But all of them lived with the consequences of what they'd done to Helena. The way they'd treated her, the way they'd reduced her to a dollar amount and waited for her to die. They couldn't undo that. They couldn't apologize to her. She was gone. All they could do was live differently. Be different. Hope that somewhere, somehow, Helena knew they were trying. That was the true inheritance. Not $17 million. Not a mansion in Westchester. Not trust funds or portfolios or property. In the end, maybe it was the only gift she had left to give. The inheritance was never about the money. It was about showing them who they were when money was taken away. It was about forcing them to build something real instead of waiting for something unearned. Some of them learned that lesson. So did just the knowledge that love matters more than money. That respect matters more than inheritance. That the way you treat people while they're alive is the only legacy that matters. Helena Whitmore spent her final years making sure her family learned that lesson. It cost them everything they thought they wanted, but it gave them something they didn't know they needed. The truth about who they were. And a chance to become something better.